But because of the timing of the adoption of the local plan and the publication of Pan 84 in particular, we did make a decision in recognising the importance of that to prepare supplementary planning guidance, which we did in 2009. And that very much reflects the national policy position. So we're requiring a 50% reduction, as SPP and Pan 84 said. But we also say that where it can be demonstrated that for technical or planning reasons this can't be achieved on site, then developers must provide equivalent carbon savings elsewhere in the area through the installation of low and zero carbon technology, or make a financial contribution to the Council's carbon offset fund. And the purpose of that fund is to have a ring-fenced pot of money that we can use to put in energy-saving measures, particularly in regeneration areas, to address issues relating to fuel poverty. As I said earlier, both SPP 6 and Pan 84 have been superseded by the new SPP, but we're still continuing to apply our supplementary planning guidance until the new building standards regulations kick in October this year, which will make this redundant. In addition to our statutory planning policy, the Council's also adopted our own sustainable building standards, which set minimum standards for council buildings and developments proposals. The standards are based on the Sustainability Building Code developed by the Building Research Establishment, and they're designed specifically for Aberdeen. So they take into account our economy, our environment, our weather, all those kinds of things. And they're intended to apply to planning and building both individual buildings up to, through small-scale housing estates, up to big housing estates, and anything else in between. And the process helps at both a strategic level and at a more detailed estate and site level by focusing on the sustainability aspects of development. And it includes things like water efficiency and reuse, energy use and generation, use of recycled, locally sourced materials, climate change, access to transport, green space, a whole range of issues which we can give you more information on if you're interested. The standards have already been applied to a number of council projects, including the design specification for our new build council housing. The issue there, I think, particularly in terms of the second and third phases, is that the view I'm getting from our housing colleagues is that it does increase the unit costs, and we only have a limited budget to build these houses. Janice looks like she's got a view on that, which I'm sure she'll give us later on. I've also been reliably informed that the standards have been applied to our new build schools as well. So again, examples of individual buildings through to larger housing estates. Currently, these standards do only apply to council developments. There is no requirement for private developers to comply with these standards, although they are available and could be used as best practice examples for them. At the time the standards were developed, we did have a long debate as to whether or not we should try to produce these as supplementary planning guidance. I think, it came back to the kinds of issues about, well, how can we enforce them? Do we really have the capacity to do that? Have we got the skills and have we got the expertise? But as you'll hear in a minute, we are rethinking that policy approach now. So hopefully you can see from what I've said, we've got a fairly robust and extensive planning policy framework in place to support energy-efficient building. And we hope to improve on that when we produce our new local development plan, which will replace our plan that was adopted in 2008. And the reason we need to produce a new local development plan is partly to comply with the new structure plan, but also because under the reform and modernisation of planning throughout Scotland, we now have to move from local plans to local development plans. The first stage in the process of preparing the new local development plan was the production of a main issues report, which does pretty much what it says. It sets out what we think are the main issues for the future development of the city over the next 10 to 15 years. And one of the key issues identified in that report was sustainable construction. The main issues report was subject to a period of public consultation to get views from the public, developers and others on what they thought to the policy approaches we were proposing. And for sustainable construction, what we proposed was the application of the Council's building standards to all developments. The results of the consultation were pretty positive, or at least they weren't negative, and there was a general kind of endorsement and support for the approach that we were applying. As well as the idea of applying the sustainable construction standards to all developments, we had to take account of the requirements of the Climate Change Scotland Act, And as I said, we haven't been told how to do that, so we've had to come up with our own method of doing it, requiring all buildings to make energy efficiency savings very specifically by using the low and zero carbon generating technologies. And as Gavin says, there's no requirement to do that under the building regulations, but we are being required to do it under the planning regulations. And the other important thing to note is it is only new buildings. So again, it comes back to the point, I think it was Richard, was it made about, well, what happens about roads and the other things that are associated with the buildings. But by implementing that policy, what it effectively means is that by 2016 or 2017, all developments will be carbon negative because they'll already need to be carbon neutral to comply with building standards and our structure plan. And if we're then applying the requirements of the Climate Change Act, they'll become carbon negative. We're looking at the detail of how that policy can be made to work along with the Scottish Government. And we think that that will mean that we not just comply with the Climate Change Scotland Act, but we also probably go beyond that. We're amongst the first planning authority in Scotland to try to do this. And so there'll be a lot of people watching us and hopefully using it as best practice if we can get it to work. A couple of the challenges in trying to do it are about how do we decide what the best year is? Or I haven't said what we're doing yet, have I? What the policy is going to say is that new developments will be required to meet progressive levels of performance in specific years during the local development plan period from 2012 up to 2016. So, and the idea is that by setting the progressive levels over a period of time, it will allow the construction industry a bit of time to adapt and to get used to the idea that they have to implement these changes, rather than expecting an immediate response of saying, well, by 2016, you have to have done the whole shebang. But as I said, one of the difficulties has been determining the dates for when we have that increment in the progression through the requirements. As building standards change, if we put in a new date that's the same date as that, then it's a big impact all of a sudden on developers. It's also been important that we can justify the percentage of savings that we require so that we can justify them and defend them at an inquiry into the plan. So should we be asking for 1%, 5%, 10%, 15%? You'll probably be able to tell from what I'm saying so far that it hasn't actually been all that easy to keep up with the changing requirements in the legislation and national policy. No sooner do we feel like we've just got to grips with having a local policy to deal with one set of regulations and legislation, and we get another one coming into place. But hopefully, by the time we've adopted a new local development plan and the supplementary guidance associated with that, we will, for the first time, have an up-to-date planning policy framework from the national level right through to the local level. And I hope that Jean thinks that that meets his definition of what's required for an energy-efficient building policy. Whether or not it's sufficient to overcome the planning and policy boundaries identified by the Build with Care project remains to be seen. But I think there is some evidence of a shift in culture. The Council's received a number of planning applications over the last couple of years, approval of which has included a condition requiring low or even zero carbon technology. 33 planning applications, and they include developments from small-scale housing, 2 or 3, 4 homes, conversion of existing properties into flats and houses, larger housing developments, a cafe, offices and industrial workshops, community centres, an extension to a church, further development of this campus by Robert Gordon's University, and the illustration on there is of the SEPA and SNH building, which you'll hear more about this afternoon. So I think we've at least got some people thinking about energy efficiency in the developments, but I'm not yet claiming that we've mainstreamed it by any means. Most common forms of technology that have been used are the air source and ground source heat pumps, heat recovery and solar collectors. And we had a bit of discussion about, well, why them? And that seems to be the obvious things about they're relatively cheap, they're relatively easy to install, they're tried and tested, you don't need a certain amount of wind and those kinds of things. So they're the ones that we've got most experience of dealing with.